Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video in my Working in Publishing series. I'm Katie, as most of you will know, and this is my friend Ellie.
Hi!
So Ellie also works in publishing. She's also a bookstagrammer and used to do BookTube a year or two ago.
More like 4 years ago. It's been a very long time.
But we originally met through BookTube, and then we also worked together a bit in publishing, so I thought I would bring Ellie in to have a more in-depth chat about publishing. So what we thought we would do today is talk through the kind of different departments and areas of publishing in the UK, because I feel like when a lot of people want to work in publishing, they know about like editorial and publicity and marketing and like not a lot of the rest. So that's what we thought we would do today.
And I will say I was exactly like that as well. I knew what editorial was and I thought, oh, I don't really want to be an editor, so maybe publishing isn't for me, which I now realize is not the case.
So I'm an assistant editor. I work in editorial at a fiction publisher.
And I work as a foreign rights assistant in a illustrated nonfiction publisher.
So before we talk about like different departments in publishing, we wanted to talk about a few of the like divisions within publishing. So I feel like one of the biggest divisions in the UK publishing industry is between academic and trade publishing.
Yeah, because I personally don't really know much about academic publishing because I've always worked in trade, but there's a lot of different jobs that are available in academic publishing.
Yeah, and in fact, I think in some ways academic publishing is bigger.
I don't think it's not just books that are published by academic publishers. It's also
papers and journals and journal articles. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think academic publishing in general caters to universities and students and academics and research, whereas trade publishing is books you buy in bookshops for the most part. So biographies and memoirs and cookbooks and novels and all of that stuff is trade. When you think of working in publishing, I think most people think of working in trade, whereas actually academic is pretty big. It is fairly easy within my experience, or not easy, but it is possible to move around in different areas in trade, but it is harder to move between trade and academic, and most people I know who work in trade or academic haven't worked in both. It's not impossible. I do know some people who work in trade who have worked in academic, but for the most part that is like the biggest division. And if you like books and words, or if you like things to do with making books but you're not fussed about working in trade, there are a lot of jobs in academic publishing, and that might make it slightly easier to get into.
And it's better paid usually.
It is better paid, yeah.
Better paid, probably easier to get into, and I think you'd still have an interesting career.
Definitely. Yeah, the people I know who work in academic really like it too.
Another big division in publishing is whether you work in illustrated or non-illustrated books.
So I would say, like, you might think if you don't work in publishing that the main division within trade is between fiction and non-fiction, but it's really not, because the way you make a biography is the same way you make a novel. Obviously the text is different, but like everything else that goes into the book is quite similar, which means that like the main difference is between illustrated and non-illustrated, because if you're working on a cookbook, that's very, very different to making a biography or a novel.
Should we explain maybe what illustrated means?
Yes.
So,
because it obviously doesn't mean illustrated. It does not mean there are images, but they could be photographs or illustrations or whatever.
Exactly. So those could be cookbooks, they could be lifestyle books, they could be Mind, Body, Spirit is a big part of illustrated nonfiction. Art books is a very huge market. Children's picture books, a lot of children's books are illustrated.
And I think working in illustrated and not illustrated is quite different. So I used to work in illustrated nonfiction, and I now work in fiction, and certainly the work I do is very different. Like the skills are all kind of the same, but the work is very, very different, especially as an editor, and that I find quite interesting. And also I would say the departments tend to be a bit different in illustrated nonfiction. We'll talk about that a bit later, but there are certain departments which are much bigger in an illustrated nonfiction publishing company than there would be in
my department.
Saying that though, I would say there is a difference between working in fiction and working in non-fiction. There are some jobs which will be working in non-fiction and fiction, especially in like certain departments. I think you're more likely to work across both at certain publishers depending on the size of them. But obviously if you read one and prefer one, you might prefer to work in that.
I think that's definitely especially the case if you're working in editorial, but if you're working in sales or certain other departments, it doesn't actually really matter what kind of books you're publishing.
Yeah, the work is probably more similar, I would say, in like sales between non-fiction and fiction than it is in like what I do if you're working editorial. I would say as well there's probably another division between like adults and children's.
Yeah, so I think what I find kind of interesting is that you'll have some publishers that do illustrated nonfiction and fiction. They'll have like different divisions for both. But you don't tend to have a children's publisher who also publishes adult books.
Yeah, they tend to be, like, children's and adults tend to be fairly separate. Another area of the publishing industry, which I feel like we haven't touched on, is literary agents, which is actually something I think another like another area that a lot of people don't know about. Literary agents are the people like in between writers and publishers. They are the people who like negotiate for writers, who represent writers, and their like legal interests to publishers, and who work with publishers and writers to kind of make sure everything goes smoothly. Literary agents have quite interesting jobs because it's like some editorial work, some rights work, some sales work. Like they do a big mix of stuff, which I think can be really interesting and would appeal to a lot of people, and would mean that you get to know a lot of areas of the industry. Quite a lot of literary agents used to be editors, but also quite a lot of literary agents have always been literary agents or used to be salespeople. So that's another like career option, which I think a lot of people don't know about, but actually there are a lot of agents and they are needed, and it is quite an interesting route to go into. Before we go on to departments, the only other thing I wanted to talk about was like the differences between working for a very big company and a very small company, because there's a lot of like big publishing companies that employ hundreds of people, but there's also a lot of very small ones, and I think it's very different working for a very small one to working for a very big one. So I've worked in a very small one, a very big one, and I work in a mid-sized one. And I certainly think there's a lot of differences. If you work in a small publisher, you're more likely to do more admin even when you're higher up, but you're also more likely to have the opportunities to do things like above your job level earlier. Whereas in big companies, you're more likely to be like set in a structure. The first company I worked at, because there were 10 of us, I also like bought milk and took out the bins, but I also got to do like, I was also like commissioning illustrators when I'd been in publishing 6 months. So there's a lot of like ups and downs, I think, about working in bigger or smaller companies.
I work for a pretty big publisher, and so my role is very set in stone, and I have very clear tasks, and I don't tend to veer off of those tasks. So I guess that could be good in a way, because you always know what you're doing, but you have a lot less impact on different areas of the business.
Yeah, and I think often it can depend on whether you value structure or responsibility more, and obviously there's a lot more like systems and structures in place. Things can often run more smoothly in bigger companies, but in smaller companies you can learn a lot of different things.
There can be more creativity.
Yeah, and I think as well, if you start in a small publisher, you learn a lot more about how the industry works faster.
So next we thought it would be really interesting to go through the different departments you have in a typical publishing house and give you just like a rundown of what happens in those departments, because as we discussed, a lot of times you don't really know what department you would work in, or you just assume that you would either be in marketing or in editorial. And I think for me it would have been really interesting to know more of this earlier, because I never saw myself in the typical roles that you think of when you think of publishing.
Yeah. So editorial, I feel like, is one of the departments that the most people have heard of, and that is where the editors work who edit the books. Obviously, this varies, as I said, between illustrated nonfiction and fiction. For example, one of the big differences, I think, in fiction, the books come to you and agents submit books to you, and if you really like the book you might buy it as a more senior editor, whereas if you are in illustrated nonfiction especially, you might often commission a book, so you might be the one that comes up with the idea. And there are two like departments sort of within editorial, depending on the publisher. Sometimes these are actual different departments, and sometimes these are just like different roles within a department. But there is like commissioning, so they're the people who like commission things or like acquire a book from an agent / writer, and they also do a big structural edit. And then there is desk editing, who are the people who look after the books like when they get into the more nitty-gritty stages, and sort copy edits and proofreaders and kind of making sure the book goes on the page in the right way, often briefing typesetters and that kind of thing, or briefing the designer who is designing in-house when it's illustrated nonfiction. Then there's also publicity and marketing, which I think is one of the other areas that a lot of people know stuff about or imagine themselves getting into. Though a lot of people don't know the difference between publicity and marketing. It took me many years, well, some years in publishing before I worked out the difference between publicity and marketing. But basically, publicity and marketing, they're usually like sort of one department, but different teams within one department, and they are the people who publicise and market the book and make sure as many people know about it as possible. So publicists and publicity like organise events, and they send out books for review to newspapers and reviewers and magazines and things like that, and they often also work with bloggers to kind of publicise the book. And then marketing are the people who like produce lots of different materials, so if ever there are like leaflets or posters for books, they will be made by the marketing team, and they're also the people who do social media. That's now a huge area of marketing. That's like the broad difference between publicity and marketing, and I would say like both of them are quite good areas to get into if you have lots of like really creative ideas for campaigns. Often like while publicity will be part of a campaign, it'll be marketing who like decide in what way a campaign will be run. I think if you're quite a creative thinker, and also if you kind of like designy things but you don't actually want to design a book cover, then marketing might be a good area for you as well. And they're also areas where you get to work quite closely with authors. I would say like the people who spend the most time with and talking to authors and kind of working very closely with authors would be their editors and their publicists. So if you want to work closely with authors, publicity might be a good area to go into.
So production are basically the unsung heroes of a publishing house. They have such an important job, and I think a lot of times people forget about production.
I'd never heard of it before I worked in
And
publishing.
I also think that production people can sometimes feel like their job and their impact is overlooked, but it is very important. So production handles the physical aspect of the book. They make sure all the nitty-gritty details are kept in focus and make sure that the cover finishes make sense. They are the ones that are in contact with the printer. They're the ones that go over proofs. They have a very, very important job in making sure a book gets published physically and also that it looks okay.
Yeah, so like at where I work, I give the production department a PDF, they make it into a book. And also in Illustrated, they do a lot of like quality checks on images and like adjusting all the images to make sure they look better. So if you're interested in production, I think illustrated nonfiction is probably one of the most interesting areas to work in, and also one of the biggest. Like my production department where I work now in fiction is really small, whereas when I worked in illustrated nonfiction, the production department was huge. It was really, really big and like a really, really key part. And it's something that's really, really interesting and I think a bit forgotten about. And it's the kind of thing as well, if you're interested in design, but you don't necessarily want to design a cover, but you want to have some impact in like what the book looks like, then production I think is quite an interesting area to work in. So we also wanted to talk about design, which is quite an important department. Again, I think this is one where much bigger in illustrated nonfiction than in fiction, because obviously in fiction, designers are just pretty much designing the front cover. Occasionally they have a role in typesetting. Often that's also editorial or production, but that depends like so much between publishers. But then in illustrated nonfiction, where the whole book is designed like spread by spread inside, then design have a really, really important role and will tend to be a really big department. And design is quite simply where you design the books in all of the different ways. And I feel like design is probably one of the most like specialist departments within publishing. It's one of the only ones where I think you probably have to have a specific like kind of qualification. A lot of people who work in design did book design courses at like master's level or uni, or have like degrees in art. And I think it is the most like specialist one where you have to have a particular talent that you can't learn probably.
And I think it's also one where you could move in from a different type of industry, like from another type of industry.
If you're a graphic designer of any kind, I think you could move into book design
quite easily. Yeah, and you can move out as well. So sales is quite a huge department in most publishing houses because it's separated in a bunch of different subdivisions. So you'll usually have, in the UK, you'll have UK sales, and even that is divided into different departments. So you'll have special sales, which deals with museums or with certain types of book outlets like the Book People, or what's another one?
The Works.
Who
are like discount wholesalers.
Yeah, discount wholesalers, things like that. You'll also have those who deal with bookshops, and you'll have like key account people who deal with a specific bookshop only.
Or a specific supermarket.
Yeah, or a specific supermarket as well. So there's all these different little divisions within sales, and then that's just UK sales. Then you have international sales, and that's usually you'll have like export people who sell to bookshops overseas. So sales, I think, is a really interesting department to look into if you enjoy talking about books. So I worked as a bookseller, and obviously I did booktube videos way back in the day, and I really enjoy talking about books with people. And I think that with sales, whether it's foreign rights, UK sales, specials, what you're really doing is you're talking about books to people who want to talk about books with you. And as long as you understand the market that you're selling towards, it could be a really interesting and like really exciting career that I don't think many people think about.
Yeah, I think as well, if you want to work in publicity and marketing, you probably will actually also enjoy working in sales, because a lot of it is just like, instead of talking about how amazing the book is and selling it to the public, you're just selling it to specific retailers.
It's a lot about like, building relationships with people and building relationships with your customers and your clients. Unlike if you're a bookseller, your customers are just people coming to buy a book. These are people who are looking to buy thousands of them. And you get to, I know from people who work in different sales departments, you really get to know who you're selling to over the years. So I work in foreign rights, which is a type of sales. Instead of selling the English book, like with export to a foreign market, what you're selling is the book to be translated into a foreign language and then published by a foreign publisher in their home market. I work as a foreign rights assistant, but what I also do is fulfillment. And I think an important thing to understand with foreign rights is that it's quite different if you're working for a non-illustrated publisher or whether you're working for an illustrated publisher. If you're working for a non-illustrated publisher, you're usually just selling the translation rights, and sometimes you'll sell like, the cover design as well. And if you're working for an illustrated publisher, you're usually going to be printing that book for the foreign publisher in what we call a co-edition deal. A co-edition is where you have several editions printing at the same time. So for example, you have the UK edition printing along with a German edition, a Russian edition, and then it lowers the overall cost for everyone involved, because what's really expensive about illustrated books is the plate that's used to make the color images. You can switch out the black text plate and it's a lot less expensive than switching out a color text plate. So if you print all of these at the same time, it costs less overall. So a lot of what I do is make sure that these co-edition printings work. So I will chase the files from the foreign publisher. I will make sure proofs are sent on time, make sure everything is approved on time. And you won't really have this job if you're working in a non-illustrated publisher. So what I like about my job is that there's a little bit of the production element, but it's also salesy in that you're dealing with like a sales department. And one important thing that you need to know about foreign rights is that if you want to become a foreign rights manager, is that you go to book fairs, and those are really fun because you get to meet all of your customers in person and you just like quickly pitch books for like half an hour at a time. And I really, really enjoy going to book fairs. So foreign rights is one aspect of rights, but then in different publishers, you'll also have licensing. A licensing department would be more prevalent in a publisher that deals with brands or deals with children's books. Like think of Harry Potter. You need to sell the sublicense of those characters in order to get merchandise created. And then if you work in a non-illustrated publisher, let's say who does fiction, you'll often, need to sell film rights, television rights, and there's like a whole slew of different types of rights that you can sell. But I personally only deal with foreign rights.
Would you say that to work in foreign rights, you need to speak more than one language?
So I think it's beneficial in some ways. So for example, I speak French, so I'm able to talk to our customers directly in French. But I have a lot of colleagues who just speak English or who speak, kind of intermediate level. I've worked in a publisher where only one of the managers actually spoke a foreign language and the others didn't, and it was totally fine. So it's always good, but I don't think it's essential in all ways.
So two other departments within publishing, both of which are growing quite a lot in the UK at the moment, are audio and digital. I'm talking about these together because in some publishers they are one department. But so to start with digital, the digital department are the team who make the ebooks. Sometimes the editors make the ebooks, and who distribute the ebooks and work with Amazon and Kobo and iBooks and all the different distributors of ebooks to ensure those ebooks are sort of correctly made and put out there to the world. Sometimes digital is a part of editorial, and mostly does the making of ebooks. Sometimes digital is a part of sales and mostly does the selling of ebooks. I've experienced this to be quite different in different publishers. And then the audio department do deal with audiobooks, obviously. In a fiction publisher, the audiobook team will get in the full book from the editors, and they'll usually get a casting brief from the editors saying, this is the kind of narrator we want, and these are the accents they have to be able to do. And then the audio team will go away, cast a reader, and they will book in sessions and get that reader to read out the audiobook. The audiobook team will often work with a particular studio, or a publisher might have their own studio if they're larger, in order to do the recording. Audiobooks is a really growing area of the market at the moment because audiobooks are really booming, which makes me happy because I love audiobooks. So definitely if you're interested in audiobooks, now is a good time to be looking for jobs, I think.
So contracts and legal, depending on what kind of publisher you're working for, might be quite a big department, might be quite a small department. So what they'll do is they will usually draft the contracts with authors. They'll do author contracts. In some small publishers, they may even do negotiations with agents. That's what I've...
Yeah, sometimes that's editors. I think that varies.
But often there'll also be legal reads of a book, depending on how controversial it might be.
Yeah, particularly celebrity memoirs and autobiographies, things like that often need a legal read to check that no one's going to be accused of libel. Often the permissions department will be part of contracts and legal. So if, say, another book publisher want to include an extract of a particular book in their book, then they will need to contact the original publishers to get permission, and that is often part of contracts and legal as well. Often within a contracts or legal team within a publisher, one person at least will be a qualified solicitor, but often not everyone else will, and a lot of the rest of the support will be people who are not qualified lawyers. So you don't necessarily have to be a qualified lawyer to work in contracts or legal in publishing.
So finance is also an important department that people forget exists. And there's a lot of smaller roles within finance that I think no one really knows about, including us.
Yeah.
They basically track the financial health of the company throughout the year. They also are the ones that would process invoices and pay authors and freelancers. At least where I work, we have a small royalties department. They will send out the invoices to foreign publishers. They will handle the royalties from different deals.
I think that's probably all. I think that's all of the departments within the publishing companies that I've worked in. So a lot of the departments and the department size will depend on the size of publisher you work at. I've worked at a publishing house where there was literally just editorial, sales and production. But I've also worked in much bigger publishing houses that had all of these departments and many sub-departments within them. So I think a lot of it depends on the size, but there are definitely a lot of areas of publishing that you could go into and that are really interesting. And also, if you have any questions about any of the particular departments within publishing or anything more you'd like to know, I am going to be doing a Q&A at the end of my Working in Publishing series. So leave your questions down below and I will try to get back to them at some point in this series.
So we hope you enjoyed this video. As Katie said, if you have any questions, let us know.
And yeah, thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video. Right, so
wait, are we filming right now?
It's
we've
recording.
been filming
It's
the whole
time.
So next, all the outtakes are going to be Beacon going, what am I doing? What am I saying? Oh my god, I can't talk.
Talking is hard, right?
It's like, it's the pressure. It's the pressure of making sense.
Yeah, so I like how in my list I put editorial first.
Because editors always think they're so important.
Very important.
Typical editor.